Okay, we're going to make a start now, and so we're streaming live on YouTube. So I'm really pleased to be launching the new Open Labour pamphlet, which is a progressive foreign policy for new times. We started on this months ago, over 6 months ago, when Harry Pitts and Paul Thompson emailed Open Labour with basically pretty much a complete pamphlet at that point. And myself and Mary were involved in the the foreign policy motion to Open Labour conference last year. And so I contacted Mary and we wrote the foreword. I think it's fair to say that there are areas that the pamphlet really is about opening a discussion for how to do foreign policy differently. And the ideas in the foreword, which myself and Mary wrote, aren't exactly the same as the ideas in the main pamphlet that Harry and Paul wrote. And that's all about the sort of pluralism of the left that we sort of support in Open Labour, that it's really about having a discussion, debate, and a juxtaposition of ideas, and how we can utilise that debate for creating a new foreign policy. So some of the sort of things that myself and Mary are really passionate about, and Mary will talk about them after me, it is that that we have about this idea of human security, that without human security, you can't have national security. You know, that includes ideas around the climate as well as traditional foreign policy ideas, and having a holistic approach. And in the foreword, you'll read that there's actually a centre for human security now in the Ministry of Defence. And those things are to be absolutely welcomed and built on, by a Labour government. And we also, are passionate about the right to self-determination, which is a sort of crossover between the sort of politics, the sort of progressive foreign policy politics that we espouse, and also the anti-imperialist left. So there's lots of, crossovers, but there's also significant differences. And the area probably of debate, and we'll probably get onto this later, where there are the widest range of differences, probably is about intervention, military intervention, how you do it, when you do it, why you do it. And so the lineup we've got today, I think, reflects a broad set of views. So I'm just introducing. Then we're going to have Mary Caldor, who co-wrote the foreword with me. Then the authors, Harry Pitts and Paul Thompson. Then we're going to have Lisa Nandy, the Shadow Foreign Secretary. I'm really pleased Lisa could come. And some of this was trailed in Labour List Day, which she was going to say. So I'm really excited to hear Lisa's contribution, and hopefully we can engage as an organisation with Lisa in developing foreign policy over the next 4 years or so. And then we're going to have the authors. Then I'm really pleased that we've got Wad El-Khatib, who is the maker of the For Sama documentary, and also was the reporter for Channel 4 in Syria during the conflict, and has come to this country now and is a real voice for Syrian people. Is on the British Syria Council and has got obviously a huge amount of experience and the work. And I think we are going to try and show some of For Sama if the technology allows, and maybe just say a little bit about Open Labour. A lot of people on the call and watching are members of Open Labour, come to Open Labour events in the past on our mailing list, but there'll be other people who aren't. Open Labour started 5 years ago because we didn't feel that the tradition in the Labour Party of a sort of open, pluralistic, socialist, democratic ideas were being had an organisation for those ideas to be based in the wider party for party members, and that we've been on quite a journey in those 5 years, and I think the thing that we've really stuck to our democratic ideals. So every time that the Open Labour endorses candidates in internal elections, members are consulted. When we had the endorsement for the leadership election, we had an all-members ballot, and we endorsed Lisa Nandy. So it's great to have her back tonight for the leadership. And those sort of values that we espouse, we also look to build policy, and we're doing that again democratic through policy conference this year. Because of COVID, we couldn't have one. But next year, we're already starting to plan one, thinking about online, offline world and how to do that in this brave new world. But it's great that so many people are here today. And I've already run over my time. So I'm going to hand over Mary Caldor who I'm not sure whether she's muted or not. We've got so many people on this. So hopefully me or somebody else who is in charge can unmute Mary. I'm going to try and work this through.
I'm unmuted, don't worry.
Great, so off you go, Mary.
I think this COVID moment is a really good time to be thinking about human security. The numbers are really terrifying, I think. More than twice as many people have died from COVID in this country than died in the Blitz during the Second World War. And in America, almost every day, more people die than were killed in the 9/11 events. And I say this to make the point that this is an existential moment when actually what we're really concerned about is the well-being and safety of individuals. And, you know, for the moment, the key workers are not soldiers, but health workers. So it's kind of like a war, but a different kind of existential moment. Actually, soldiers are relevant, but not relevant as soldiers. They're helping with the vaccine, they're helping they're helping with test and trace and so on. So that's the first thing I wanted to say. And so what do we mean when we say it's, you know, Alex and me say it's a moment when we should have a human security-based foreign policy? Actually, I think it's more or less what Robin Cook meant when he talked about an ethical foreign policy. He talked about a rules-based system, but actually, if we go back in history, you know, periods of peace are always rules-based systems, but what's new now is the idea that it's based on human rights. And that makes a really big difference. So it's about working towards a global rule of law that is based on human rights. And why is it important? Well, particularly now, since we've left the European Union, there's no way we can defend ourselves unilaterally. The idea that we can somehow defend ourselves against a foreign threat and that is the centerpiece of our foreign policy. The only way we can really be safe is if we live in a safer world. And I think the way to live in a safer world is to promote human security. So what do I mean by that? I mean, human security is what we enjoy in a rights-based, law-governed society like the UK. If something awful happens, a terrorist attack, a pandemic, floods, fire, we expect that emergency services will be available to come to our help. We expect there to be firefighters, police, health workers, the NHS, and so on. That's really the way we should think about it globally. Instead of defeating enemies, what we should think about is how to extend that to the rest of the world, and how could we contribute to that? How could we contribute to global emergency services that would help people in the case of emergencies? I mean, we do to some extent already do that. You know, the UN and the EU provide, and DFID actually, enormous, DFID as it was, FCDO, provides enormous amounts of humanitarian assistance. And, you know, those kind of emergency services would include humanitarian aid workers, they'd include medical experts, they'd include development experts, and they'd also include police and the military. But I think the military would need to be used in a very different way. And that's, I don't know if it's where I differ from Harry and Paul, but that's where the second issue that I wanted to raise, which is this whole issue of humanitarian intervention and responsibility to protect. For some reason, we've been completely obsessed with the issue of when is it right to use military force. And actually, of course, it's right to go to the are suffering from terrible disasters. Of course, we need to be able to do that. But the question is, what is the best way to do that? And actually, using the military in classic warfighting ways, using airstrikes, is not a very good way of doing it. It doesn't mean there isn't a role for the military, but it's a very different sort of role. It's about protecting people. It's about creating safe humanitarian spaces. where people can feel safe. It's about acting much more like police. It's about arresting war criminals rather than defeating enemies. And it's about dampening down violence rather than trying to win. And, you know, we've had several examples of things that go under the rubric of responsibility to protect. And we talk about it in the pamphlet, and I won't go on just purely for time reasons. Both Kosovo and Libya had very good goals, but they had very blunt instruments. And we can talk about it more. I won't go into detail. I thought the one example I would mention was the bombing of ISIS, which I know that a lot of people in the Labour Party supported, and Hilary Benn made that speech that everyone was very enthusiastic about it. But I think it was not a good way of dealing with ISIS. Yes, it succeeded in the end in dislodging ISIS, but at a huge cost. Very, very high numbers of civilian casualties, and towns like Raqqa and Mosul were reduced to rubble. In my program, we've talked to people in those areas, and of course they hated ISIS, but they feel even more angry with the coalition because they've lost so many relatives, so many deaths, and they've lost their homes and they've become displaced people. And what is more, ISIS is reappearing in those areas. So I'm giving you that as an example, but of where I have real doubts about the use of airstrikes as an instrument of humanitarian intervention. And I think the nice thing about human security is it's not so much about the responsibility to intervene as the right to be protected. And what we really want to focus on is what's the best way to save people's lives. So now, finally, I just wanted to make one last point of something very practical that I think Labour could do, which would be a human security approach. The integrated review of foreign defence and security spending is likely to come out with saying that there should be a focus on addressing conflicts. And I think that's right. And I think Lisa was quite right when she criticised the cuts to the Conflict and Stability Fund, because I do think a lot of human security has to do, and we'll hear from Wad later about what we should be doing in Syria. But I think human security does have a lot to do with helping people, individual people and their families who are the victims of contemporary conflicts. And I think one of the things about contemporary conflicts is that the way to describe them might be as a sort of mixture of terrorism and organized crime. And global flows of money are hugely important in sustaining these conflicts. Organized crime is hugely important in all of these conflicts. And so I think what we know is that London is a centre for laundering money. And that seems to me something the UK could do very usefully. There are lots of ways of thinking about increasing the transparency of the City of London or dealing with the property market. I think Global Witness came out with an estimate that something like 100 billion worth of UK property is held by anonymous companies, probably linked to organised crime. It's an ideal way of money laundering. So I think this is something that the UK could really make a difference in conflict. So that would be a very practical example of the kind of approach to foreign policy, which is human security based, that we might think about in the future.
Thank you, Mary. we'll now go on to Lisa. I'm really pleased that Lisa could make it today. And I didn't say in my introduction, but this pamphlet isn't the be all and end all of Open Labour's pamphleteering on foreign policy. It's merely the start. And we had a discussion in committee, and we've also I spoke to Mary today about this. Actually, we're going to commission a whole series of pamphlets, and hopefully we can utilise them to engage with Lisa and a team. And it's great to see Wayne David from the Shadow Foreign Office team on the call as well, and utilise the knowledge of our members and others in the foreign policy, international development, international trade, and all the sort of international relations world that we've got contact with in the broader party, to bring these ideas forward and have these sort of debates. So without any further ado, I'm going to hand over to Lisa, who I can see is unmuted. So over to you, Lisa.
Oh, thank you so much, Alex, for having me, and also to you and to Harry and to Mary and to David and others for the amount of work that's gone into producing this pamphlet. It just feels to me that this is exactly the right time, when we're marking the start of a new chapter, albeit a chapter that none of us really wanted to see. We've left the European Union in January. We leave the transition period in a few weeks' time, although God knows, following what Michael Gove is up to, in what state we will. But we are leaving the transition. And with the election as well of Joe Biden and Kamala Harris in the United States, this is the moment, I think, where the world is starting to look forwards, and we must look forward too. And just to say on a very personal note that, you know, having watched the election of Kamala Harris in particular over in the United States, although there's no room for complacency, the future is yet to be determined, and whether there is a bright future for the world or not is largely up to us. There was something quite moving about seeing a chapter in history where we've seen migrant children caged and the Muslim ban implemented, and one of the world's most powerful countries attacking and undermining multilateral institutions. There was something quite moving about seeing that end with the election of the first woman of colour to serve as Vice President of the United States. And so this is a moment where we can start, potentially, the power is in our hands to turn the page on the darkest, most divisive period in global history that I can remember. And after years of division, Keir and I and the rest of the team are very much looking to the future. I think COVID-19 has shown two visions of what the world can be. We've had the scramble for a vaccine, rising vaccine nationalism, attempts to buy up quantities of that and deny it to others, attacks on the World Health Organization, the scapegoating of migrants, the labeling of this disease as the China disease. We've seen all of that and the ramping up of hostilities between two global superpowers. But at the same time, even as the global context became harder for those medics, those scientists who were cooperating to try to pursue better treatment, diagnostics, and vaccines, even as that environment became more toxic and more hostile, they continued to cooperate, often at great personal risk across national boundaries, in order to save millions of lives. That to me is the spirit that I want Labour to conjure up as we look to the future. And the world that we inherit in 2024 is going to be profoundly different from the world that we inherited in 1997. We're richer but less happy. We're less violent, but we're more insecure. We're more interconnected, but we're more divided. We're more educated, but we're less equal. And this is against a backdrop of huge change. In geopolitics, we've seen the rise of Asia, particularly China. We've seen a transformation of the global economy with big implications for the environment and for changing technology as well. A friend of mine reminded me the other day that it was 1996 when the first email was exchanged between world leaders, just a year before Labour took office. Just contrast that with the situation now, where at the touch of a button, weapons can be deployed on the other side of the world. So I wanted to say to you, first of all, that we can learn from our past in Labour, and we should and we must. But one of the things that I found really inspirational about this pamphlet is that I think it's based on the belief that I also share, that while we learn from the past, we must never be bound by it. And we need to build a foreign policy that is fit for the realities of this century and not the circumstances of the last. I was a teenager when Robin Cook made his foreign policy with an ethical dimension speech, and I won't deny that it had a profound effect on me, as it has done on many people in the Labour movement. And those values that Mary talked about, rule of law, democracy, and what was then an emerging agenda on human rights, continue to be important to Labour, the moral centre that we want to restore to our approach to internationalism. But as Mary suggested, to those I would add new values of feminism, of environmentalism, and of human security as well. I think what the last few years has really reminded me is that in an interconnected world, working people in particular must stand together or suffer the consequences. Now, I know this personally because decades before I was born, before my parents even met, a campaign that was fought by the Indian independence movement, which one side of my family was involved in over in India, was having devastating consequences for the Lancashire textile workers. Many of my family who worked in those textile mills over in Lancashire. And they lived out both sides of that struggle. And despite the huge costs, what's always inspired me about that story that's become sort of legend in our family is how they refused to allow it to divide them, because they knew that it wasn't working people in India or in Lancashire who were to blame. It was the system that was exploiting both. So when Gandhi visited Lancashire, members of my family were amongst those who welcomed him, because they knew that solidarity amongst working people is the answer and never the problem, and that their struggle was one and the same. Now, why do I tell this story? Because I think as we leave the European Union and we look to the future, that attempt on Tory benches to somehow pit internationalism against nationalism, to somehow say that you can stand up for the national interests, you can be patriotic, or you can be an internationalist, but you can't do both. That is the argument that we have to defeat. And that is an argument that we have to have and we have to win. And that's why I say to you, as the first Shadow Foreign Secretary to serve in this party in almost half a century, as we stand outside of the European Union, that we will always be a proudly internationalist party, because the socialism that I believe in is one that looks beyond national borders, and it includes, as Mary said, that economic insecurity that afflicts families here and across the world. Throughout history, it's been in times of insecurity that we've lost the ability to understand one another, and that does harm to us here in the United Kingdom and harm to us across the world. So when the Director General of the World Health Organization says that the biggest challenge we now face is not the virus itself, but the lack of leadership and solidarity globally and locally, we must respond. And just like those members of my family in India and Lancashire all those years ago who understood the danger of allowing ourselves to be divided and chose to stand together, we've got to forge a new internationalism that stands up for working people here and working people across the world. We should stand with the exploited garment workers in Bangladesh and the low-paid workers in Britain who rely on cheap clothes for their families. So when I've said in the past, which provoked some controversy in the Labour Party, that we will always put the interests of British people first, that is rooted in a commitment to internationalism that understands that working people's interests are bound together. And it's rooted in a belief that things can and they must change. Now, when I look around the world, I see some of this developing. I see leaders like Jacinda Ardern, who are taking action on climate change that absolutely shames this Tory government. Her government's become the first in the world to rein in the global financial risks created by climate change. Now, why is she doing this? She's doing it because she understands that it isn't just that we have a moral obligation to the poorest abroad who suffer from inaction on the climate emergency, but it's because it is working class people in New Zealand and Britain whose pensions and savings are bound up in fossil fuels who stand to lose most if we do not act now. And I think she offers us some clues to the future too, because across the world during this pandemic, whether it's Denmark or New Zealand, we've seen leaders who are showing a different sort of leadership. Leaders who know that compromise is not cowardice, leaders who have the courage to be honest and the self-confidence to change their minds, leaders who want to go out and shed light, not might, around the world. You know, we've had this sort of idea of empire in Britain quite often, in which our identity has been forged. I hear it a lot on the Tory benches, this idea of a country that ruled the waves, ruled Britannia. And in recent years, I think that's been sort of given way to a nostalgia rooted in the history of the Second World War that somehow says that we're a small island nation that goes out punching above its weight, without ever really stopping to ask why on earth it is that we're punching at all. And that's why I believe that Labour has to set out not just an opposition to what this government is doing, trashing our relationships around the world, undermining our influence abroad, but also an alternative to show a sort of leadership that shows that compromise is not cowardice, to show the courage to be honest and the self-confidence to change our minds, to fly the pride flag at our embassies in countries where simply loving who we love is a crime, punishable often by death, to stand with those brave young people in Hong Kong and the Black Lives Matters activists in the United States, to match the courage of the women of Belarus as they put everything on the line in order to defend freedom. This is a country that sheds light, not might, around the world. And as the world becomes stronger and more secure and hope burns a little bit brighter because of that sort of leadership, I hope it gives us the courage and the confidence to take us through the next few years into government, because this is the country that we can be. Now, I'll just finally say this, that with the Brexit question now settled, it's been a painful period for the country and it's been a painful period for the Labour Party, but now is the moment to look for the future. And I wanted to say to you tonight that we've left the European Union, but our future and our interests clearly lie with Europe. When Russian agents used chemical weapons on the streets of the United Kingdom, where did Theresa May turn for help? She turned to our closest neighbours who stood alongside us when we expelled Russian diplomats. You contrast that with this sorry excuse for the government, which so far has even refused to discuss how we work with other countries to defend democracy, to protect national security, taking foreign policy, security and defence off the table in the negotiations. And just ask yourself this, if that Salisbury attack took place tomorrow, where would our government turn for help? That's a question any responsible government would not just ask, but be able to answer. But it's one that this government simply cannot. With every passing day, Global Britain always has long been a slogan and not a strategy, looks more and more like Britain adrift. And the election of Joe Biden has surely got to be a wake-up call to this government, that the close ties that this government seeks with the United States depend on repairing our needlessly antagonistic relationships with our Irish friends and our European neighbours. But how depressing that it took the President-elect of the United States to stand up for those relationships and to stand up for people in Northern Ireland rather than the United Kingdom government itself. That's why we've said, Keir and I, that we will not wait for this government. Since we took office, we've reached out to governments, sister parties and the trade union movement across the world and in Europe to forge a better future together. And we've stood alongside our sister parties from the United States to Ireland to reaffirm that the Good Friday Agreement remains an article of faith for us in the Labour Party, and it always will. And we've been looking beyond Europe as well to forge and reforge alliances across the world. In the Commonwealth, for example, where the treatment of the Windrush generation has done so much damage to Britain's standing in the world and the relationships that we need. We've been standing with them to help those countries defend their democracies when they're under attack and build a common future together, and to show a moral consistency as well that has done us so much harm over recent years. When we are the penholder for Yemen at the United Nations, we should not be selling arms to Saudi Arabia that are used against the people of Yemen and the children of Yemen with appalling consequences. And we are determined that we'll restore that moral consistency back to the heart of our approach to the rest of the world. It's through our friendships that we are going to build the independence necessary to stand up for and advance the values that we want to see, like light, not might, around the world: human rights, democracy, the rule of law, wherever and whenever they're threatened. So whether it's the treatment of the Uyghur in China or the Black Lives Matter protesters in the United States, we have to be in a position to stand up for those values without fear or favour, and that we will gain that through the basis of those friendships and those alliances that we build around the world that allow us to do this. So let's reject the Tory vision of you can be for your country or you can be for the world. We have to be both, and we've known that all the way through our history, but perhaps most of all when Bevin was Foreign Secretary, when he built a global system that was designed to work for working people here and working people across the world as well. That is how we'll move the world forwards. This is the future calling. And together, I believe that we can start to turn the page on this dark, divisive, populist period and start to shed light in the world again.
Well, Lisa, that was an absolute tour de force. Every day that passes that Dominic Raab is Foreign Secretary and you're not is a day that diminishes this country, and we cannot wait until we win that election and see you on the global stage at the UN, you know, and undertaking what we as members of the Labour Party, and I think the people of this country, want to see Britain's role be. I'm now feeling a little bit sorry for Paul and Harry having to follow that, but thanks so much. And I'm going to ask Paul and Harry to talk a little bit about their pamphlet. I don't know who's going first.
I'm going to go first. Can you hear me?
Yep. Go ahead, Paul.
Great. Thanks, Alex, and thanks, Lisa. It was a pleasure to hear that. Unlike Mary, Harry and I are not foreign policy experts, and I mean, that's not an anti-expert comment, just a statement of reality. We drafted this pamphlet not 6 months ago when we sent it to you, Alex, but many months before that, in the dying days of the just before the general election, and obviously it kind of got swept aside for a while. Our motive was, you know, to pick up on a point you made earlier, was to try and open up more of a debate on foreign policy, because it struck us that a lot of innovative work had been done around economic and industrial policy, but very little, if anything, on foreign policy. And in fact, it was worse than that. We seemed to be stuck in a time warp where we seem to be operating on the basis of a kind of Cold War, post-Cold War world of what we call in the pamphlet two-campism, in which the world's divided into West versus the rest, and the West is invested with motives, interests, and powers, and the rest is seen as reactive to those powers. And that time warp, and that time warp is, in our view, roughly coming under the heading of anti-imperialism. And to us, it was part of the legacy of the lot of the people who'd been involved in the Corbyn project, the baggage they brought with them from previous eras, and explained some of the really poor things that happened during that period, like our inability to respond adequately to the Russian chemical attacks on UK soil. But the main point that the pamphlet, the early part of the pamphlet, tries to make is that anti-imperialism is strategically, ethically, politically, whatever purchase it had in the past is out of date. I mean, without getting into any theory, obviously anti-imperialism assumes certain configurations of state power and economic power. And the point we try to make is that these views don't tell us anything strategically and ethically any longer about state and economic power, because we really have moved on from that period of American hegemony and those particular configurations of military and economic power. And the way we try and frame this is to talk about the need to start from the recognition that we operate in a fragmented, multipolar global polity, where the starting point is, if one looks at many of the foreign policy, foreign politics hotspots, if you like, conflicts around the globe, what we see is a very complex mixture of state actors and their proxies and practices, where we simply have to take seriously the state power, the state projects of Russia, China, Turkey, Iran, Saudi Arabia, because without doing that, without, the two-campism basically just does not engage with this multipolar, fragmented world. And when we talk about Russia and China, for example, and about economic power, it's not just about the alliances that they're building, particularly Russia in particular conflicts. It's the fact of taking seriously the economic power now wielded through state projects initiated and alliances initiated by Russia and China, because there's incredible powers of the equivalence, in a sense, of capital involved in the Belt and Road project, in the Russian oligarchic structure of economic power, and so on. So it's about getting real about the foreign policy landscape, in a sense, that we're operating within, but really want to emphasize, particularly in the light of some of the criticisms that the article on Labour List that Harry and I trailed for the pamphlet and the launch of the pamphlet. The pamphlet doesn't argue for a reverse to-campism in which we are or should be hitched to US power or are uncritical of it. As the then editor of Renewal, I wrote and campaigned against the Iraq War. And clearly there were and are elements of US policy, particularly under Trump, which would require us to build alliances against American foreign policy. And hopefully, as Lisa says, that is now beginning to change. So we focused on Russia and China to an extent in the pamphlet, partly because the so-called anti-imperialist left are, in essence, almost wholly silent or evasive about the kind of state and economic power wielded by Russia and China and its alliances. So that's why we focused on it, not because we regard them, if you like, as the only focal point of critique or interest. What we're calling for in the pamphlet is a kind of radical realism. On the realism side, it's really about understanding that the kind of alliances that we would want to build for progressive interventions around human security and human rights and so on are always bounded by our ability to persuade others to act in alliance with us, and also by our capacity to build domestic consent for various kinds of intervention. But if we can have a more realistic and radical sense of the landscape, it will allow us to do more progressive things. And I'll hand over to Harry to point out a few of those at this point.
Yeah. So, I mean, one of the kind of dangers of, being progressive or being radical is the sense that things inevitably, favor the positive and will unfold in a positive direction. And that things get better, but they don't only get better, they get worse. And over the last few years, we've seen, whether it's Trump in the White House, eroding multilateral institutions, or the situation in Syria, we've seen how things can get worse. And I guess that kind of pessimistic perspective guides a little bit of how we're thinking about specifically about liberal democracy, not only on a national context as a political system, but as a global system of institutions, which as people on the left we might have criticisms of, but nonetheless defend a space for democracy and for experimentation with alternatives, within constraints on a national and a global level. And the fact that those institutions also exist to expand that space as well. And people struggle for that and are often repressed and subject to violence by dictators who it's not in their interest to take a turn towards a more democratic direction. Now, the point is that space needs to be preserved, expanded, created, protected, and there's resources of soft and hard power available to do that. So that's the kind of radical element of that, in the sense that we recognise that there's worse things available than the status quo, and that we've seen things shift in a different direction in recent years, which doesn't do the left any favours. And the kind of sea within which we swim is that sea of liberal democracy. Now, the UK alone, we've talked about the post-Brexit context, and this is where the realism comes in, occupies on its own as a small island and etc. All the kind of romantic ideas of us in splendid isolation occupies on its own, a weak and lonely situation, although we do to some extent, command a power above that status. That might not last very much longer under this government. But the reality is, and the realism is, that we're also going to have to rely upon and strike other kinds of alliances and partnerships to be able to, protect, defend and expand that space of liberal democratic freedoms that, again, we might have criticisms of, but still sustain the best basis for the types of policies and reforms that we want to see. And that's going to be the US to some extent, which under Trump took a very different flavour, but under Biden, we can see more potential to work with that. And I think, our Labour list piece received quite a lot of kind of commentary about the perceived Atlanticism of that. And to some extent, the US is going to be indispensable in some situations where you can't really do without the US on the global stage, at least under the kind of leadership that we're hoping for from Biden. But it's also going to be about working with our European partners as well and navigating a different position through the kind of two camps in what might be an emerging Cold War that we're in at the moment. Although, there is some argument for a 2.5 campist position where you don't throw your lot in just with one side, but we do recognise that there are better and worse realities and options within the world. And this protection and expansion of liberal democracy should not just be seen as a national project constrained within our own borders, but we also have to have a commitment to that on a global level as well. And this is where the human element, I think human security is a great concept to be working with, the fact that there's a global humanity that unites us, and that, as people on the left, we should be interested in the breaking down of the national fragmentation of that. Now, one of the things that has been levelled at us, and I've kind of observed some of the kind of social media invective about this, is that we're kind of arguing for a warmongering, neocon, military expeditionist position, which I mean is some of the points of criticism are well taken from committed and consistent anti-imperialists, but some of it is a little bit wayward and comes from the kind of usual suspects that are problematic on a number of other issues as well. The idea that what we're arguing for is a restoration of US hegemony that involves the bombing of minorities the world over, etc. Now, often the point that is taken, and levelled is the situation that unfolded in Iraq. And, I was very young then, one of the few people marching in a small Cornish market town against Iraq. If anyone watched the BBC documentary that was recently broadcast, Once Upon a Time in Iraq, it shows absolutely the errors of Western intervention there. Although intervention, I think, is a word that doesn't necessarily apply particularly well. It's more like an invasion and a war of a much different kind of complex than the ones we're talking about. Now, the standpoint we adopt in this article is not the standpoint really of casting Iraq over the history that followed, but using the standpoint where we're talking about intervention of Syria. And it's a much more recent example. It doesn't fit the template of what happened in Iraq, but Iraq's a convenient alibi for a left that was either caught sleeping on Syria or, in some quarters, willingly complicit in conspiracy theories, defences of the regime, or kind of blind ignorance about the consequences of the Russian intervention there. So, I mean, in terms of thinking about Syria, this isn't just a question of starting foreign wars, which is another argument against the piece that we've written, akin to Iraq. This is the case, and we see this a lot around the world. The wars are already happening. The idea that what is achievable is a kind of stop the war campaign where we can opt out of the world and have peace ourselves doesn't always recognize the fact that the wars are already happening. The question is, how can we best use the position we're in with our allies and our partners to leverage the resources we have to achieve a situation of peace? And this, I mean, Mary has written extensively about this, including in the foreword, but elsewhere, about the best way to do that. And we don't recommend in the paper airstrikes or feet on the ground in terms of how to solve situations as they arise, although I guess the rapid response needed to some of the situations we've seen in recent years in Syria, it may necessitate some other forms of intervention. Now, Lisa mentioned light, not might, as a principle for acting in the world. But the trouble is, might has a power of its own, and it can unfold in unpredictable ways that we play. And we've seen this over recent years, specifically in that arena in the Middle East. The interventions there are already happening. The idea that we're arguing for intervention already happens in the world, and where the US has intervened in the Middle East. I mean, this is something we maybe didn't capture really in the pamphlet. The fact that the US has been active, and under Trump, the bombing auspiciously against ISIS was a human disaster with massive human costs and was done in a flagrant and a completely irresponsible fashion. We've seen interventions in Libya as well. But other interventions are happening. The West is not the only one that acts. And this is, again, getting past that two-campism. There are Russian interventions, Iranian interventions, Turkish interventions. In some cases, the Turkish interventions standing as the only thing between the regime and the Russian forces and the welfare of civilians in Idlib at one point. Those interventions are already happening, and they have a logic of their own. Deals are cut. Countries like Turkey pursue their own regional ambitions against our Kurdish allies. Iranian militias pursue their own interests against Sunni Muslims, for instance. And Russia can perceive its own interest in shoring up the Assad regime and committing war crimes against civilians. Those interventions are already happening. So this isn't to advocate for military action, but just to try to overcome the sometimes very self-centered view of international affairs that the left can sometimes perceive, that stops at our national borders. As long as we're not involved, we can exist in a space of pristine purity. And what's peace for us isn't always peace elsewhere. So we need to be responsible on the left about actually being able to have discussions about how we can use the resources at our disposal to create a more peaceful world. And that doesn't necessarily always mean we sit on our hands and talk. As a last resource, there may be military force involved, but principally it's about building resources of soft power, of promoting liberal democratic norms, even where we might see them as an unsatisfactory substitute for something better in the longer run. And also to, not let us just move past things like Syria as if they never happened. We all carry Iraq with us in the Labour Party and in the UK as a whole, and the losses of lives there of civilians and of members of the military forces as well. But Syria is a recent example that too easily we let escape our consciences, and the consequences there are not just specific to that country, but eroded norms and standards that are going to resonate around the world in years to come next time this situation rears its head. And we shouldn't see that as a lost cause. I know Wad is speaking after me, and I'm very honoured to be able to be speaking on the same panel as her. I'm sure she's going to talk in more detail about it. So I actually think human security versus national security is a great way of looking at this. And to that extent, our pamphlet isn't as opposed to the forward as it might seem. I think this privileging of the national and seeing the global as an imposition upon it is part of the problem that the left has in thinking through foreign affairs. And the question is how we put the pieces back together of a fragmented global order so that we can get past the isolation of us into small nations where people are bordered by artificial, long-standing borders, to kind of get a greater sense of our commitment to one another and our solidarity with one another as humans, united by that, but also united in that we also live on the same planet. So, yeah, I think that's the kind of bigger picture stuff that sits alongside the critique of anti-imperialism that Paul voiced. So thanks very much for having us here. Thanks
so much, Harry. I think that there's a lot more discussion with Harry and Paul that we can have, and the different points of view which have been played out in the chat. But now I'm really absolutely delighted to introduce Wad. We've never had an Oscar nominee on an Open Labour event before, or a winner of an Emmy. We have had a BAFTA winner though, so we're obviously going one up on that front. So it's great to introduce Wad, and I'm going to ask her to unmute, and hopefully she can tell us more about her experience, what her views of how the UK should be approaching Syria. Over to you, Wad.
I can't hear.
No. Wad, are you there? You're unmuted. You can go ahead.
Can you hear me now?
Yes. Yeah. There you go. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I was like, thank you so much, Alex, and thanks everyone. Thanks, Harry, for this. I mean, I'm speechless to hear what you were like talking about. And I'm very glad to be part of this conversation, because for years we were very unfortunately disappointed by so much of the world, but I want to specific today about people within the Labour Party who were denying not just what we lived through, but also all the crimes that was happening in Syria. And I mean, this conversation is very important at this time, as maybe Mari or Lisa mentioned before. This is like the time of COVID, when so many people start to feel like some similarity in the situation and facing the same, maybe challenging. But at the same time, as today, exactly like 4 years ago, I was still in Aleppo, and 5 days from now, we didn't know what will happen in Syria. I've never knew if I will survive or not. Same to my husband, my daughter, and so many people with us. And like over 300,000 people were besieged in Aleppo, and the regime was just taking an area after an area. They were shelling us 24 hours, attacking hospitals, attacking schools, civil defense people. And it was just kind of like, there's no word could describe like that situation. And with all of this, we were really feeling pain. We felt that we were let down by the whole world. But the most thing was making us really feel like pain was when we open social media and we see like people from the West, some journalists, some politicians, some people within the Labour Party, again, they were kind of like doubting these crimes and spreading lies about us, about what was happening in Syria, spreading also the narrative of the people who are killing us. And, you know, like, this is not just like about things happening today. This is about things happened for 5 years at that time in Syria. Now we are speaking about 10 years. We are talking about over like 500,000 people who were killed in Syria. We are talking about 12 million refugees internally and like outside Syria. We are talking about over 130,000 people who disappeared by Assad in his presence. And all of this is not just numbers. It's people who have life. It's people like every one of you who are listening today. And it's about like the future that we have in Syria. It's about all the past. It's about country who is never existed now. And we are not talking about also crimes that committed, as I just mentioned, 4 years ago. This is still happening as we speak. The regime is still arresting people in Damascus and in other areas in Syria. The regime is still shelling areas in Idlib today. And we are now still like about a conversation, you know, about what we've done right, what we've done wrong. We have seen the action and the effect of action and the legacy of Iraq, of Afghanistan, but we also have seen the lack of inaction in Syria. And all of this that I just mentioned, this is like part of the result of the inaction that happened in Syria. And like when I remember exactly this, one of my friends who was here in the UK, he came to Aleppo in 2013, and that was after the chemical attack that happened. And I remember how he was watching the debate, and he was very shocked about all of this conversation, and people who were like that didn't say that this was right or wrong. And also we've seen witness after that so much massacres. I mean, I myself witnessed so much of the gas massacres in Aleppo, and all of this is part of this consequences about what happened in Syria. And when I'm talking about all of this, this is not a call for intervention. This is just to understand that action has cost, but also an action has another cost. And for this, I mean, please do treat every conflict separately. Syria is not Iraq, Syria is not Afghanistan, and Syria is not Libya even, and Syria is just Syria. This is a war crime that is committing and have been committing every day as we speak for the last 10 years. So we should just stand for our humanity, for our better future for all of us. When this crime is accepted in Syria, I don't know where it could be tomorrow here, and some of the people will be fine about it. So this is not just something related to us. And of course, when we are talking about Libya or Iraq or Afghanistan or any of this legacy or these stories, this is not Syria that we dreamt of in 2011. But of course, for sure, this is not the Syria that we wanted, which we can see today. So we really would love to ask the opposition, and we are asking the opposition to put more pressure on the UK government to do more for Syria, to stand against Russia, to stop all these crimes that is happening now. And it's very important for all of us to not be scared to name the perpetrator. And in order to stop these crimes, we have to think about how we can hold this perpetrator for accountability. And for this, we need the truth and the only truth. And for this truth, we need you all. We need to see what the reality of what happened in Syria. We need you to stand with us, stand with your values of human rights, and for a better future for all of us. I can really talk for tomorrow about all of these things. And I myself personally, I'm not well today at all, but I just I'm so grateful for this opportunity, because for years we've never been heard by the Labour Party, and I'm really seeing that this is an amazing opportunity. And also I'm seeing so much changing is happening, and that gave us so much hope. All the Syrians who now in the UK, all the Syrians who are today in Syria, they have so much hope for anything you can do for us. And just like today, I'm also speaking next to Lisa, which we had an amazing meeting last week, and we can see how things might be changed. And we have, again, hope with what you can do for Syria, what you can do for the future of all of us. Thank you so much. And I really wish to see a real action towards Syria and toward what happened.
Thank you, Wad. I know you've not been well, so really grateful for you coming on and talking today. And as you said, you've already met with Lisa. You've had the opportunity today to talk to Lisa and two shadow ministers. We do want to engage with you and the Syrian British Council and the expatriate Syrian community, like we do with other communities, particularly where there is still violence ongoing and oppression. And it's really important that we speak up and amplify your voice and the voice of other Syrians, particularly in the UK. I'm going to bring in David Taylor next. And David actually is the person that knows Wad and got her in and has been working with her for a number of years within the Labour Party and has done such a lot of great work. I've known him for over 10 years. You know, he's been an absolute stalwart of the Labour campaign for international development. And he's just going to talk about their Right to Protect project and some of their other work. So David, I think you can unmute yourself. So I think you can come in now.
Yes, thanks very much, Alex. I think I am unmuted. And I just want to add to Alex's thanks to Wad. I know you've been struggling today and feeling under the weather. So thank you so much for taking the time to speak to us tonight. It really is an honour for us all. And it really is a privilege for us as ELSID to be working with you and the other members of the Syrian British Council to support you in advocating for a free and democratic Syria. And, you know, I was reading in this view that you'd done where you said that I don't want your tears, I want action. And that really is the challenge for all of us tonight. How can we ensure that Britain and the international community acts in a way where we protect civilians from mass atrocities in Syria and elsewhere? And, you know, it really has been a source of real shame to see the way in which the Labour Party has let you and other Syrian people down over the last few years. As this paper has highlighted, too often Labour's approach to Syria and other countries has been rigid and dogmatic, instead of listening to what you and other civilians around the world want Labour to do. And it's, you know, absolutely brilliant that we're able to move forward in a new direction now under the leadership of Lisa and Wayne, David and Anna McMorran. And I want to thank Lisa and Wayne, who I know is also on the call, for taking the time to be with us here tonight, but also for meeting with the Syrian British Council the other night, and for the work that you're doing to hold the government to account on its policies on Syria. Now, just turning to the report itself, I want to pay tribute to Harry and Paul for this report. It's an excellent report, and we're really pleased to be supporting Open Labour in the publication of this. It was actually something that was first commissioned as part of a Labour Together project on internationalism that Lisa and I were involved in last year, and so it's brilliant it's finally been published. And from an ELSID perspective, look, the central thing that we take away from this is the call for Labour's foreign policy to be built on the legacy of Robin Cook and Joe Cox. We can't support that enough. Joe was a passionate believer that Britain and the international community has a responsibility to protect civilians from mass atrocity. She, before she was murdered, was writing a report called The Cost of Doing Nothing that really sought to refresh the responsibility to protect framework. And it's something that ELSID strongly backs. And it argues that in responding to any conflict, wherever it is in the world, we should use all tools at our disposal to protect people from hurt. And that includes diplomatic means, it includes sanctions, but yes, it does include, in the most extreme cases, military operations such as no-fly zones and enforcing safe havens. And Joe also argued that whatever action we decided to take or not take, we stand ready to help people rebuild their countries once the conflict is over. Now, Joe, like Robin Cook and probably everyone on this call, including myself, was opposed to the Iraq war. And of course, we have to learn the lessons of Iraq when we're looking at how we act in future. But we must also learn the lessons from Kosovo, from Rwanda, from Bosnia, and from Syria as well as we deliberate what to do. And most of all, it is absolutely essential that in any discussions we're having on foreign policy in this country or in the Labour Party, we listen to the people actually caught up in conflict. And that's why I'm so pleased that WAD has been able to join us tonight. And it's why ELSID has launched a speakers network where we're trying to raise awareness of these issues amongst the Labour Party in partnership with the Syrian British Council, but also speakers from the World Uyghur Congress and activists from Kosovo, Yemen, Rwanda, Bosnia and Afghanistan as well. And so if you'd like one of our speakers to come and speak to your local CLP or even an Open Labour event you're organising locally, then I will put a link in the chat for you to request one of our speakers. And yeah, I mean, thank you so much. Thank you to all the other speakers and joining us for this event here today. And thank you for all of you for listening. I'm really looking forward to the discussion we've got in the time we've got left.
Thanks so much, David. We're going to move straight into that discussion. So the first question I've got, which was actually asked at 7:05, so right before I'd start speaking, from James Sheward, which is, what do the panel believe to be the key priority issues for the new year? And I'm going to start with Harry.
I think probably the future of the Iranian nuclear deal, I mean, seems to me something that's coming down the line quite quick, and Trump appears to be hell-bent on trying to cause as much damage to that on his way out of office as possible. I think it's going to be a hard job putting that back together, because I think over the recent years, you know, Iranian actions in the region through militias in Syria, Iraq, elsewhere has intensified, and to the extent to which that gets rolled up then with renegotiating the deal is going to be a key question, I think, and that's kind of immediate term. Biden's first challenges coming into office, and of course the UK and European allies have been kind of playing a key role in trying to hold things together. As far as I can see, cycle of retaliation, intensification of tensions only really is going to help the regime in Iran, and against further stifle attempts on activists and other dissenters to try to bring Iran in a more democratic and free direction. So I think that, off the top of my head, that I think is the key challenge in the new year. Obviously, apart from our own concerns around Brexit, but I think the Iranian nuclear deal was on a different kind of level. Yeah,
great. I mean, we are looking at global ones rather than our own. That's almost a domestic policy issue, isn't it? It is what it is, a domestic policy issue. I'm going to go to Lisa next, and Wad's still here, so I'm going to ask Wad if she wants to talk about that as well. I think it's a good opportunity for us to speak to us in the Labour Party. So, Lisa.
Thanks very much. I guess I would just I'd do a typical politician thing and say something quite broad so that I can lump a load of stuff inside it. But I mean, I think the biggest priority, especially with the incoming Biden administration, is to get the world working together again. We've seen a real tug of war going on in the last few months during COVID between people who want to see the world come together to deal with the challenges that we face and people who want to see the world break apart. And Britain has got to be on the right side of that. That's one of the reasons why I was so, I thought it was such a generous offer when Keir offered me this post, because it is one of the few areas when you're in opposition where you can actually reach out and start to be an active participant in those discussions and those trends, not just a commentator. And that's one of the reasons why we've really prioritised reaching out to other countries as well, to do what we can to help to make sure that we're building those relationships and those alliances to get us into the right place. There are two overwhelming reasons. I mean, Harry mentioned the Iran nuclear deal, and that's absolutely right. And we may have a chance at building a slightly more secure world as a consequence of what's happened in the United States. But the two major overwhelming priorities for me, the first is COVID. If we don't get the world to come together to deal with COVID, then we're not just going to see a continuation of the health crisis, but we're going to see an economic crisis, the like of which we haven't seen. And we'll see it hit developing countries first, but you will see that economic hemorrhaging spreading right the way through the economic global system. So we've got to come together and find a solution to that. And so far, attempts to get the world to step up have been really sadly lacking. But secondly, because what's coming behind COVID, which will hit us really, really hard like a second wave, is climate change. And that's not, that's an existential crisis. It threatens the future of the planet. But in the very immediate term, it's a moral crisis, and it's an economic crisis as well. It threatens people's pensions, savings, jobs, livelihoods. We just cannot afford to neglect it. Now, next year is the G7 and COP26, and the UK is hosting both of those. So getting Britain to start to reverse a decade of retreat and start to step back into the world again, that is going to be a major priority for us. And while we're doing that, we're very, very mindful of, Wad just talked really movingly about what is happening in Syria and why the world cannot afford to allow what we did allow previously, which was a vacuum to develop, and those who seek to make the situation worse stepped into that vacuum, and we are where we are as a consequence. So we're very, very keen to get those forgotten crises back onto the agenda. Yemen, the world's worst humanitarian disaster, Syria, which has now been raging as a conflict longer than the Second World War. We want to make sure that these issues get back onto the global agenda. And as the opposition, we've been working very hard, I think when David's on this call, at making sure that these are on the agenda. And we really want to work with Wad and others to make sure that it happens. It's a sort of thank you to Open Labour, this really, from me, because governments only act when they feel under pressure, and it takes a movement to change things.
Thanks so much, Lisa. I'm just seeing Wad's still here, and Wad wants to. I think she is actually on. So I'm gonna actually move on to the next question, because that was sort of like an opener. So the next one is from Amy Dwyer, and she says, what can we do to create and champion a feminist foreign policy? So I'm going to bring Mary in first on that one.
I think there's lots we could do, and let's hope Lisa is going to be our champion of feminist foreign policy. Just in relation to what we've been talking about, what Lisa just said about the priorities, I completely agree with. But if we're thinking about how to work together and how to address the problems, I think there are two things we need to do. One is that we need to think of ways to lessen the strength of populist authoritarian governments all around the world, because they're the ones that are preventing us from working together. And that's very much linked to feminism. I have a colleague who describes contemporary populist authoritarianism as a mixture of ethnic nationalism or racism, crony capitalism, as I was talking about before, and toxic masculinity. So masculinity is really central to the authoritarian populace. So that's one issue that we really need to talk about. But on the other side of the coin, and I think Wad was a wonderful representative of that, if we're really going to think of the good ways, I mean, David was going on about the importance of intervening, but how you intervene really depends on engaging civil society and particularly engaging women. And I think that's really important when we're talking about, say, Syria or Afghanistan. You know, there are talks going on between really armed groups. And in the case of Afghanistan, it's between the Taliban and the US, you know, and the idea of a deal for the future of Afghanistan between the Taliban and the US is really frightening. So what we really need to do is hugely involve women's groups and civil society in all of these kinds of processes. And this is something we can really do. I mean, Staffan de Misturas, the special Syrian envoy, did bring in a civil society room and a women's advisory group. And we should try to do that in every conflict that we observe. And then finally, on all the other issues, well, we are seeing that whether it's COVID or whether it's climate change, we are seeing that it's people like Jacinta Ardern and others who are really taking the lead on these issues and really thinking about the gender implications and not simply thinking about it in the abstract. Oh, and I suppose a final point I want to make is when I talk about human security, I think it's really important to think about human beings as you know, they're part of cultures, they're gendered. So it's really important to think both about men and women.
Thank you, Mary. I'm going to bring Lisa in on this one, and then I'm going to ask Paul if he wants to come in on this one, but if he doesn't, I'll understand. So Lisa.
I think it's, I mean, from my point of view, it's even more important that we get men talking about how they can advance feminist foreign policy than it is women. But I guess I just wanted to echo a few things that Mary just said. I mean, the pandemic has really shown the problem with the lack of feminist lens through which we view foreign policy. There is just absolutely no question that the COVID pandemic has allowed the advances that we've made in the treatment of women to go into reverse. If you look at, you know, any of the available evidence, whether it's UN country directors who were surveyed recently, who were asked, you know, sexual violence and sexual gender-based violence got worse during the pandemic in your country, 2/3 of them said yes, and 14% of them said it would significantly worse. We've seen it in the UK as well. Domestic violence has increased, but we know that it rises by about 50% in conflict zones. There's direct effects, but then there's indirect effects as well. And I think this really links to something that David was saying, echoing Joe Cox, which is that there are costs to inaction as well as costs to action. And when I worked with child refugees before I came into Parliament, I saw that very clearly. You've got to get the action right. And that is no reason to, you know, this is, you know, as Harry said, this is not about trying, and Paul, that this is not about rejecting two campism by saying, well, let's just flip it and have reverse to campism. This is about trying to think through the values on which we anchor our decisions. I was really pleased that a new grouping called the Labour Foreign Policy Group has been set up in the Labour Party, and they chose to launch that event with me and a woman called Margaret Wallström, who was responsible for feminist foreign policy in Sweden, the world's first. That was a statement of intent from them and from me that we want to put feminism at the heart of what we do. And Keir and I have been talking to counterparts in Canada, in Australia and New Zealand about how we get the violence against women and girls agenda back on the global agenda, which has been allowed to drift since William Hague left the Foreign Office. We've also been working with the TUC and the ITUC, because often actually where you find women are in leadership roles is in civil society, whether it's in the trade union movement or elsewhere. And we want to get those voices heard and amplified as well. And I guess that's just my final point, is to echo something that Mary said, is that it's not just about getting these issues on the agenda, it's about women actually being in the driving seat of decisions, not just decisions that affect women, but decisions that affect all of us. So I was going to use the example of what's happening in Afghanistan as the example of where we need to be standing shoulder to shoulder with those women to help them advance, because many of those women have put themselves in the line of fire because they know that if the negotiations take place only between men in government and men in the Taliban, then the situation, not just for women, but the prospects for peace will be fatally undermined. And as it currently stands, there are only 4 women out of 21 on the government negotiating team, none on the Taliban side. We cannot accept that. And we've got to use the voice and the platform that we've got in order to stand up against that. This autumn is the 20th anniversary of UN Security Council Resolution 1325, which recognised the vital role that women play in peace and security. And yet here we are 20 years later, and we're just not living up to the ideals that are embodied in that security resolution. I do not want us to be having this same debate in 20 years' time. So my final plea to people on this call is that when I first got elected, I used to share an office with Chuka and Munna. John Cruddas gave us his spare office to squat in because the whips hadn't allocated an office yet. And for the first few months, we both shared an office. And I remember Chuka being interviewed about global situations, Afghanistan, Nigeria. I remember him talking with great confidence about the global economic recession and how we should respond. I remember that the questions I were asked were very much like, you know, how do you cope being away from home all week? Do you think you'll ever have children? What's it like being a woman in politics? Do you mind when people criticise how you speak or what you look like? I remember him being as frustrated as I was about it. But actually, you know, there is something that sort of seeps into the political culture, so that then when you talk to TV producers and they say we're trying to book women to come on to talk about foreign policy and defence, but we can't find anybody. And you look into the House of Commons chamber and you see Treasury debates, foreign policy debates dominated by male voices. And there are lots of women in the Labour Party like Ali McGovern who just have not accepted that and who've stepped forward and used the voice and the platform that they've got. But it is my plea to all of the women on this call is that we've got to lead by example in the Labour Party. And since I got given this post in April, I have spent far too much time on platforms where, you know, one in which sticks in my mind where I was outnumbered by a factor of 3 to 1, not just by men to women, but by men called John to the one woman who was me on the panel. We just cannot accept a situation where we're not speaking up loud and clear as well. So it's my plea to women, come forward, speak. And I, you know, as your Shadow Foreign Secretary, I will make sure that your voices are amplified and that they're heard.
Hi, sorry, I think Alex's internet has cut out. He's coming back. But
perfect moment.
While he comes back, I just want to say one thing in response. It's sort of to add to what Lisa said about Afghanistan. I'm very much involved with women in Afghanistan, and they've started a campaign called Raise a Pen, which is for girls' education in Afghanistan. And what we are suggesting is whenever you raise your hand in a Zoom session, please raise your pen. And if somebody asks you about it, you say it's for girls' education in Afghanistan.
I think Alex is back. by the looks of things.
Yes, sorry. My network bandwidth is low. I'm going to have to go and ask Paul to answer this and then go and tell the children to turn all their devices off, I think. So, Paul, over to you. And then I'm going to try and resolve my issue.
Paul, I think you need to unmute.
Okay.
Am I unmuted?
Yeah.
Yes. Perfect. Thank you.
I'm not going to compete with the last two speakers on feminist foreign policy, so I'll pass on.
Okay, if no one else is coming into anything, I will go for another question. We've got one from Georgie Smith that said, I'd be really interested to hear about how useful a term the panel think human security is when it comes to making a political argument. Whilst it makes total sense as an approach, particularly in the context of so many security issues that aren't bound by states, case in point with COVID, does it open Labour up to critique from other political parties who may deliberately misinterpret the term to suggest that we aren't serious about national security? Which is a very interesting question.
Is it on the chat?
Anyone feel free to chip in with that.
Yeah.
Can I just start off, actually, if you don't mind? I mean, I completely agree with what Mary's saying, and but I think that we can be clear about what we believe needs to be happen and what our policies are, and then have a completely different discussion about how we communicate that with the public. And you know, I work in the development sector as my day job. ELSID is also campaigning to try and defend aid and development, and I'm really keen. And the sector and ELSID is always driven by what the evidence shows will work, and there's a lot of focus group work that's being done by the aid sector to try and find the messages that do get through to the public. And you know, we've just got to cast aside our own views on what might work and just listen to what actually does work. Because, for example, there's really interesting research that was done by some focus group work that was done with Conservative voters by Save the Children, which I actually think would probably work for a lot of you know, other voters, which was actually that messages around aid being good for national security or aid being good at stopping immigration didn't actually work and didn't resonate. People were like, well, if that's my concern, then I'd rather more money went to the Home Office, or I'd rather more money went to defence. What worked and what got support for aid is when we actually concentrated on the impact that aid was actually having to make people's lives better. So I think sometimes you can be surprised about what will work in terms of the public. So I think it's a fair enough concern, but I think we could have a policy of human security and then have a completely different way of talking to the public about it.
Actually, I mean, I agree with that. And I think, you know, as we discovered from Comic Relief, Save the Children, from the whole fact that we have committed, although the government's given it up, to 0.7% for aid, people in this country really do tend to care about what happens in the rest of the world. And I think in that sense, human security is actually something that is politically quite appealing to people. I was involved in ages ago in government discussions about our role in Afghanistan. And they were constantly raising the argument that we're in Afghanistan to keep our streets safer. And I kept saying, actually, you know, I think it would go down better, both in this country and in Afghanistan, if we said we're in Afghanistan to help make Afghans safer. And that's a very explicit human security approach, or to make both British and Afghans safer. The other aspect I wanted to raise is that when we talk about intervention, we tend to think of it as very technical. But if we think about what went wrong in Syria or any of the other conflicts, a lot of it is our failure to have a political strategy that's based on human rights. You know, so in Syria, if you take the case of ISIS, which I talked about, the solution to ISIS was much more to do with politics. It had to do with discrimination against the Sunnis in Iraqi politics. It had to do with the nature of the conflict in Syria. when the war started, all the focus was on regime change rather than changing the nature of the regime, rather than talking about what happened to the citizens. So I think politics actually has to be at the heart of human security.
Thanks, Mary. I'm going to bring Paul in, and then we're going to move on to the next question. So, Paul.
Right. Okay.
So it's certainly true. I mean, the speaker raised this issue about, in a sense, the potential tension between our profile on national security and if we pushed hard on the concept of human security, and it is undoubtedly true that one of the things that undermined our credibility in the previous period leading up to general election was the electorate's concern that we did not take national security seriously enough. But I, like the other speakers, I don't think that an emphasis on human security necessarily gets in the way of that. And there are certain issues in which it's really possible to make connections. I mean, there's a lot of the time, we have this kind of high-flowing rhetoric about interconnected worlds and so on. But as Lisa said, if there's one thing that the COVID pandemic and crisis has taught us, is how intimately connected the health of the global population is, and therefore the human and national security angles. And I think that would be a good terrain to make connections between the two types of security, because unless we deal with dealing with the global pandemic in the poorer and developing nations, it's not going to be resolved for the rest of us.
Thanks, Paul. I'm going to move on to the next question, and I'm going to take Lisa first. I know Lisa might have to go after this, and thanks for your time. You gave us such a lot of time, Lisa. We're really grateful. So the next question is, where should we stand on Palestine? This is from Grace Marion, sorry. It's an injustice which continues. How can we be a positive international force? So, Lisa, over to you first. I first spoke to you on international issues about this very issue, and you've been such a force for good on it in the party.
Thanks so much. I mean, yeah, thanks for everything you've done on it, Alex, as well, because I think in the last few years, in the last 10 years that I've been in Parliament, although things have got significantly worse in the region, I think we have managed to at least provide a voice in the Labour Party and some pressure on government, which privately Tory ministers have told me has been helpful to those of them who've actually been trying and advance the situation of the Palestinian people and try and find some kind of solution. But there is absolutely no denying that during that time, things have got far worse. When I first visited the West Bank a decade ago as a new MP with Sadiq Khan and a group of Labour MPs, what we saw was that the two-state solution was becoming a fast disappearing prospect as the facts on the ground changed and the settlement buildings made a two-state solution ever more distant. And we've seen that continue over the last decade. And I think this year in particular, we ought to recognise that this has been a particularly difficult year for many Palestinians, and one in which a lot of people have really started to lose hope. Nevertheless, we have seen a suspension of the annexation plans, the Trump peace plan, which we said was a disgrace in the Labour Party and incredibly dangerous. And the election of Joe Biden, although I don't think it's a game changer in that I don't think that this is going to be the overriding priority for an incoming Biden administration, not least because there is a huge, an overwhelming priority for him to unite what remains a very, very divided country in the United States. Nevertheless, I think it opens up space for us to perhaps stop doing damage as a global community and start to perhaps create the conditions in which progress is possible. So we've said very, very clearly that the annexation plans must be dropped, and we've actually toughened up our position on that in the Labour Party in recent months. We've said that we believe that the annexation plans provide such a threat to any prospect of peace and security in the region for both Palestinians and Israelis, that we believe that should they go ahead, that the UK government ought to ban products from not just the annexed territories but from the settlements as well. We just believe that this trend cannot continue without the wider international community making clear that there are consequences. And we were heartened by the support that we got from right across the Labour movement for that position. I think it's been a very difficult few years in the Labour Party. It's left a lot of people feeling that they don't want to talk about what's happening in Israel and Palestine at all because of how toxic and difficult that debate has got. But I hope that as somebody who was chair of Labour Friends of Palestine before I took on this post, but also won the backing of the Jewish Labour movement in the leadership contest, that we can show that it is absolutely possible to stand up for the rights of the Palestinian people and for international law without being anti-Semitic or straying into that area at all. The other thing I would just say is that one of the things that has given me greatest hope during this time, a really difficult time for the prospects of peace and a two-state solution, and I remain wedded to committing to trying to achieve that, is the coexistence projects that have taken place. The first time I ever went over to the West Bank, one of the most distressing things I saw was children, Palestinian teenagers, shackled by the ankles in the military courts in trials in languages that they just didn't understand. One of the things that gave me greatest hope was meeting a group of Israeli mums who'd come down to support the Palestinian mums, were translating for them and were standing with them when they were being told that they couldn't sit near their children in the courtroom. These are the projects that give me hope, because I think what's happened in the world over recent years is that we've lost the ability to understand one another. And when you look at that generation of children that are growing up in this conflict, if the only time that you ever see during an occupation of your country, the only time that you ever see people from the other side of that divide is when your parents are being stopped and humiliated at checkpoints, or when your older brother or sister is being arrested and taken to the military courts, if the only time that you have any kind of experience of people who are living very different lives is in that context, then we are really storing up problems for the future and failing an entire generation. So I'm really committed to Labour playing its part in doing that. And one thing just to say to you all is that despite the toxicity of this debate in the Labour movement in recent months, years, what I've seen develop is something that I didn't really manage to achieve when I was chair of Labour Friends of Palestine, despite my good relations with successive chairs of LFI, which is Labour Friends of Israel and Labour Friends of Palestine, having a much more constructive, if challenging and robust, but constructive dialogue under the two current chairs, Steve McCabe and Julie Elliott. Now that has got to be a step forward, hasn't it? Because how on earth can we say to the Israelis and the Palestinians that they should come together and try to negotiate a solution if we can't even have that debate in our own party in a constructive way as well? So I think there is grounds for hope. I mean, there aren't many, if I'm honest. It feels like a very, very bleak situation, but we have to have hope. The Palestinian people don't have the luxury of abandoning hope, and therefore neither do we.
Thanks so much, Lisa. I have to say I agree with every word of that, and I really want to overstep my mark as chair and answer it, but I will restrain myself. The only thing I'm going to say is that what you said about LFI and LFPME, I'm not a member of either, and I won't become a member of either until what you've said is true, because I don't think that it helps. Although I've been to events for both, although more LFPME ones. But I'm going to go to Mary next, and then to Harry. Mary.
Well, I won't add very much because I agree with every word Lisa said too. And the only thing I really wanted to add is that it's a very good example, I'm sorry to bang on about it, of how you can change your thinking about something, because Israel always presents the situation in terms of Israel's state security. And actually, the external powers tend to go along with this state security narrative. And actually, if we keep on stressing that what we care about is the human security of both Palestinians and Israelis, and that we need a solution that will make both groups of people feel safe, that's a very good way of shifting the terrain of the debate. And I couldn't agree more about the importance. I mean, over the years, there have been so many amazing moving initiatives. It's just so terrible that they haven't gone further. But there is a sort of grassroots movement in Israel that's more concerned with social issues than these kinds of issues. But if we could somehow make it clear that the social issues are linked to the political issues, if we could bring over more of the grassroots Israeli activists, that would be incredibly important.
Thank you, Mary. I'm going to bring Harry in now, and then we're going to go to the last question, I'm afraid, because we're running out of time. Harry.
Yeah, I mean, very, very briefly, I think Lisa and Mary have captured, I think, the key issues to take away, which, I mean, obviously the Labour Party in recent years, you know, this has become a dynamic and sometimes very vexed issue, but that shouldn't prevent, you know, people being able to articulate positions on it. I think the idea, you know, some that colours some of the debate on this on the left of kind of Israel as a uniquely artificial imposition on the region. You know, I think we're doing a lot. The Labour Party is doing a lot of work to try to undo a lot of the kind of, I guess, underlying thinking. You know, that kind of that guides this type of delegitimization, I guess, of Israel as a state. Likewise, you know, it's important to also recognize, you know, and here I think the commitment to self-determination, which is articulated in Open Labour's statement of principles and in the forward, is really important for the Palestinian position. I think, you know, too often this debate has ended up breaking down into seeing two opposing forces, one good and one bad, without really considering the complexity of the politics within each nation. And, you know, to this extent, I think Mary raised a few examples there, but we can look at also the actions of trade unions and workers' movements in building solidarity across the divide from within Israel. Likewise, you know, in Palestine, there are opposing elements, you know, both reactionary and more progressive. That I think, you know, the secret to this is to try to appreciate that complexity and not kind of pose the two against one another in a way that feeds into some of the issues that we've had in the Labour Party in recent years around anti-Semitism. But, you know, it's also a kind of result maybe of some of those ways of framing the world around certain forms of kind of conspiracism. The attempt should be to kind of move past that and have a bit more of a sophisticated and a recognition of the complexities of the situation.
Okay, thanks, Harry. We're going to have our last question, which was from Georgie Smith. I'm going to go to Mary first. I think it really speaks to what Mary wrote about, but then I'm going to bring Harry and Paul and David in, and then we'll wrap up. So I've been really interested to hear about how useful a term the panel think human security is when it comes to making a political argument. Whilst it makes total sense and approach, particularly in context of so many security issues that are bound by states, the case in point being COVID, does it open Labour up to critique from other political parties who may deliberately misinterpret the term to suggest that we aren't serious about national security? Mary.
Well, we actually were asked that question when you were out of the room.
Oh.
But I don't know whether we want to repeat our answers. But
I didn't realise I was gone that long.
I'll just say something. I mean, I'll summarize one thing we said, but I think absolutely key is that we cannot have national security without global security. We live in a world where any war would be hugely destructive. We live in a world where we can't solve the problems of COVID, as Lisa said very eloquently, without being global. We live in a world where we can't solve the problem of climate change without having global agreement. And the list is endless. We live in this intercommunicating close world. So you can't have national security without human security. But added to that, I think the other thing is that there is a sense of solidarity, and that was what we were talking about earlier. There is a sense of solidarity with people in other countries, and we should appeal to that. You know, people do care about what's happening in Africa. They do care about poverty. I mean, Immanuel Kant made the point that the world has shrunk to the point where a right violated anywhere is felt everywhere. And it probably wasn't really true at the end of the 18th century when he made that point, but it's certainly true now.
Okay, so not to repeat that, I've got one which is an iteration on that, which I'm going to ask Harry and then Paul to respond to, which says, it was from Matthew Carter. How does the panel tie the term human security to the developments in artificial intelligence, robotic and cyber warfare of the future? That's a really interesting question, which I have no idea how to answer. So Harry, hopefully
do have an answer, but yeah,
I'm going to bring Harry in though, Mary. I'm going to bring Harry in.
Thought to it.
Well, I can imagine that Mary would have quite a lot to say about this, because I think it speaks to issues around drone warfare, the surgical precision of something like that, allegedly, versus other forms of acting in a sphere of warfare. I mean, I would say that there's also the issue around, we haven't really discussed it in the discussion, but around China and the US emerging tendency towards something like a Cold War, where technology is going to become a geopolitical, social, everyday kind of battleground around that, especially around the regulation of that, in ways that could mix up all the tensions we're feeling in society around the introduction of technology where it wasn't before, with the geopolitical in interesting ways. But I'm happy to pass on to others to address this in more detail.
I want to bring Paul in before we finish. Paul, do you want to respond to this? Maybe thinking about the China, building on that China-US, because I know you talked about China in the pamphlet. Oh, we need to unmute Paul. There we go. You should be able to. Yeah, that's it. You can speak now.
Yeah, just very briefly. Harry had gone to where I was going to go with raising issues about technology and communication. It's obviously been at the center. I mean, the kind of center point of Chinese strategy to become the dominant economic power has been to use communication technologies as a lever for this, and we've seen that it's raised all kinds of issues which we discuss in the pamphlet, drawing on the work of Open Labour members like Jeff Henderson, for example, who you'll know, Alex. But I mean, I want to make a point in relation to the question that was raised. Is that I think there is a danger of trying to shoehorn every dimension of foreign policy into a single concept. I mean, human security is a real development as a kind of focal point for policy, but it doesn't adequately speak to all the different foreign policy issues, and certainly China's power around communication technologies and AI and so on, I mean, are a bit more multidimensional than can be shoehorned into human security, I think.
Thank you. And I'm going to bring David in for the last word before I wrap up. So, David.
Thank you. It was just actually in relation to the previous question. I mean, we spent a lot of time rightly talking about how we win over the public, but I think this event and this pamphlet and everything we're doing here, it shows that there's actually an important debate to have within the party in a much more healthy and less confrontational way. And I've really enjoyed the discussion that we've had tonight. You know, the chat, it's been great watching the chat as well. You know, there's been back and forth, and we're not going to agree on everything, but at least if we can have a sort of proper discussion together, that will really help. And I think back to the sort of 2015 vote about bombing ISIS, and you know, there was a number of MPs that I really respect who voted different ways that night, but all of them agreed that something should be done to try and help civilians. So actually, Joe Cox abstained that night. Matthew Pennycook and Wes Streeting, I think, either voted against or abstained. They all made passionate speeches about why we should be helping people in Syria, but they didn't think this was the right approach. And of course, on the other end, you had Stephen Doughty and Hilary Benn delivering his powerful speech. So if we can at least get the party in a place where those are the parameters, we're all agreed that something should be done to help people, then I think it's fine. We're not always going to agree on what the best course of action. And so I just appeal to everyone. I mean, thank you for taking part tonight. Please do take away some of the arguments you've heard tonight and have discussions in your local Labour Party. And I think if we can get to a place where there's less anger in the party around these issues, then hopefully when we're asked to debate, Labour MPs are asked to debate these issues in Parliament, there's a much more constructive way of debating these issues and then deliberating on what needs to happen. And that's another reason why we're doing the Speakers Network, so that we can have these constructive discussions in local Labour parties with some of the people affected by conflict about the way forward. So yeah, just thank you so much. It's been really, really great to be here tonight. And thank you, Open Labour, for inviting Elsid to be part of this event. We really, really do appreciate it.
Thank you, David. And just to say, just before we close, as I said at the beginning of our work, we're already talking about developing, this is a project with many different pamphlets. And so some of the areas we're looking at are things like trade justice, the issue of China as a growing superpower in the world and all the implications that has, to develop this idea around human security, to talk about self-determination struggles and what the Open Labour approach is, which might be a bit different. And just to try and have a rounded view to work and to, I think, and Lisa was very open with Open Labour. And I think we've got not to overuse the word open door there, and with the rest of the team, because it's great for Wayne to be on this call. I know that the other members of Shadow Foreign Office team, Fabian Hamilton, Stephen Kinnett, Catherine West, also, and Stephen Doughty, also very interested in the work we're doing. So we've got a real ear there. And just to say that if you've been on the call tonight or you're watching this on YouTube, do consider joining Open Labour, getting involved in our debates, getting involved in our work. Our next event is on the 16th, which is around electoral reform and sort of progressive politics, which has actually been hosted by our regional group in the Southwest. All are welcome. If you're a member, you can come on Zoom. If not, you can watch on YouTube. So if you want to take part in the debate, do join us. Thanks to everybody for tonight. It's been a great turnout. Download the pamphlet, get involved in the debate, and hopefully see you at an event soon. Thank you very much.